Now, the Great Pyramid of Giza is probably the most stunning of all these ancient structures. And the stones are immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away.
There is a moment if you stand on the Giza Plateau at first light, when the shadow of the Great Pyramid stretches almost a mile across the desert floor before the sun climbs high enough to swallow it. Tourists take their photographs. Guides recite the numbers they have recited 10,000 times before. And somewhere behind all of it, a question sits that nobody in that crowd is really asking anymore, because we decided collectively a long time ago that the question had already been answered. Then, in a research initiative that drew far less attention than it deserved, a team of engineers and Egyptologists tried something unusual. Instead of debating the pyramid the way scholars have debated it for 2 centuries, they decided to feed it to a machine. Not to entertain it, not to dazzle it with mystery, but to test it, to see whether an artificial intelligence system built to process and cross-reference oceans of data no single human could ever hold in their head, would arrive at the same tidy conclusions we've been repeating in textbooks since the 19th century. The system they used was Grok, the large language model developed by Elon Musk's company. They loaded it with excavation reports, geological surveys, laser scan data, quarry records, papyrus translations, structural engineering papers, and decades of academic disagreement. Then they asked it a plain question. Does the evidence we have actually support the story we tell about how the Great Pyramid was built? What came back was not a story about ancient astronauts. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more unsettling, a machine calmly pointing out that the confidence in our voices has always outpaced the evidence in our hands. To understand why this exercise mattered, you have to understand what the Great Pyramid actually is, stripped of the legend. It was built for Khufu, a pharaoh of Egypt's 4th dynasty, somewhere around 2560 BCE. When it was finished, it rose approximately 146 meters into the desert sky, encased in polished white limestone that would have thrown sunlight for miles in every direction. For nearly 4,000 years, it held the record as the tallest structure ever built by human hands, a record that wasn't broken until the completion of Lincoln Cathedral's spire in the 1300s, and even then only briefly. The statistics are almost absurd to say out loud. Roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing 2.5 tons, some weighing closer to 80. A base covering more than 13 acres, level to within a couple of centimeters across its entire footprint, a tolerance that would challenge construction crews today using laser equipment and hydraulic lifts. For sides oriented to true north with an error of a fraction of a degree, suggesting either extraordinarily patient astronomical observation or a mathematical sophistication we rarely credit to the ancient world. None of these figures are disputed. Egyptologists agree on them. Structural engineers agree on them. Even the most committed skeptics of mainstream archaeology agree on them, because they've been measured and remeasured by independent teams for over 200 years. The disagreement doesn't live in the what. It lives entirely in the how. Before getting to where the official story strains, it's worth pausing on what we do know for certain, because it's easy to let the mystery erase the humanity, and that would be a mistake. In the 1990s, archaeologists working near the Giza Plateau uncovered something that quietly rewrote the popular imagination of pyramid construction. An entire settlement built to house the people who worked on the monument. Bakeries, breweries producing beer by the thousands of gallons, facilities for treating the sick and injured, cemeteries where the workers themselves were buried with a level of care and ritual that suggested genuine social standing, not disposability. Skeletal remains from that cemetery tell their own story. Archaeologists have documented healed fractures and even cases of amputation where the patient clearly survived the procedure and lived on for years afterward. That is not consistent with a workforce of expendable slaves driven by the whip, the image that dominated popular culture for so long thanks to Hollywood and 19th century Orientalist painting. It's consistent with organized labor, rotating crews, given names and identities, fed at state expense, housed in a planned community, and honored in death. We even have their handwriting, in a sense. In 1837, the British explorer Howard Vyse forced his way into a set of hidden relieving chambers above the King's Chamber, spaces built specifically to distribute the crushing weight of stone above the burial room so the ceiling wouldn't collapse under its own mass. Inside the uppermost of these chambers, painted in red ochre on stone that was never meant to be seen again by anyone, were markings left by the construction crews. Gang names, quarry marks, What amounts to graffiti? Men signing their work the way builders still do today, scrawled where no supervisor and no king was ever expected to look. It's an oddly intimate detail buried inside an otherwise monumental structure. These were not abstractions. They were people who got tired, who ate bread, who drank their ration of beer, who went home to a village at the end of the day, and who, in a private moment thousands of years ago, decided to leave a trace of themselves in a hidden room, for reasons we can only guess at. Pride, probably. Maybe just boredom. Maybe the same simple human urge that makes someone carve initials into a park bench. This is the part of the story that isn't in dispute, and it's worth sitting with because it makes what comes next so much stranger. These were not machines. They were not myths. They were ordinary mortal people working with ropes and copper chisels and their own bodies, and what they accomplished, according to the evidence, sits right at the edge of what should have been achievable with those tools. The first serious crack in the official narrative isn't about lifting. It's about distance. The king's chamber, deep inside the pyramid, is roofed with 9 massive granite beams, each weighing somewhere between 40 and 70 tons. Granite of that kind wasn't quarried anywhere near Giza. It was cut from bedrock near Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south, then somehow transported down the Nile and across the desert before being hauled to a height of over 40 meters and slotted into place inside a structure that was still under construction around it. We do have real evidence for how at least some of the pyramid's material moved. In 2013, archaeologists working at a Red Sea site called Wadi al-Jarf discovered a set of papyrus fragments, the oldest inscribed papyri ever found in Egypt. Among them was something extraordinary, the logbook of an official named Mirror who supervised a crew transporting limestone from quarries at Tura to the Giza construction site, describing a network of canals and boats used to move the stone. It's one of the most important archaeological finds of the century, and it offers direct, contemporary, written confirmation that organized water transport was part of how the pyramid was supplied. But Mirror's logbook is about limestone. Limestone is heavy, but manageable, the kind of cargo a wooden boat can carry without much drama. Granite is a different category of problem entirely. A 70-ton block isn't something you casually float on a barge without serious risk of capsizing it, and it isn't something you drag across sand on a wooden sledge without the sledge itself failing under the load. And critically, this wasn't a one-time feat, it happened repeatedly. 9 ceiling beams, additional granite lining the chamber walls, massive granite portcullis blocks used to seal the burial chamber forever after the king's body was sealed inside. This wasn't a single act of heroic engineering performed once, in a burst of unrepeatable effort. It was routine. It was, in effect, a supply chain, one capable of reliably moving 80-ton loads across hundreds of kilometers and then lifting them tens of meters into the air, apparently without a single catastrophic failure severe enough to leave a mark in the archaeological record. This is the detail the AI system's synthesis kept circling back to, according to the researchers who reviewed its output. Not that the transport was impossible. The stone is sitting up there right now, so clearly it happened, but that the specific, repeatable, step-by-step method by which it happened has never actually been demonstrated. It has been theorized. It has been modeled. It has been described in the comfortable language of likely and probably for so long that those words have quietly hardened into something resembling certainty, without ever earning it. Lifting the stone is only half the puzzle. Getting it up to height is the other half. And here the disagreement among experts becomes almost comedic in how unresolved it remains. Nobody disputes that the builders used ramps of some kind. What nobody agrees on is what those ramps actually looked like, because every proposed design runs headfirst into its own contradiction. The simplest idea is a single straight ramp, a long earthen incline running up to whatever height the crews were currently building. The problem is the math. To keep the slope gentle enough for teams to drag multi-ton blocks upward, a straight ramp reaching the pyramid's upper courses would need to be well over a kilometer long, and it would require more raw material to build than the pyramid itself. Which means that to construct one of the largest buildings ever made, the Egyptians would first have needed to construct an even larger temporary structure beside it, and then completely dismantle that structure, and erase it so thoroughly that not one trace has ever been found in over 2 centuries of digging. That's a strange kind of vanishing act for something built from literally millions of cubic meters of earth and rubble. So other researchers proposed a spiral ramp, wrapping around the exterior of the pyramid as it rose, hugging each face, and turning the corners as it climbed higher. This solves the length problem. A spiral ramp doesn't need to be nearly as long as a straight one, but it creates a new one. A ramp wrapped around the exterior would have obscured the very corners the builders needed to sight continuously in order to maintain the extraordinary precision the finished structure displays. And navigating sledges loaded with multi-ton blocks around 90-degree turns without a level surface and without modern rigging introduces exactly the kind of instability that a project demanding near-perfect tolerances couldn't easily absorb. In 2007, a French architect named Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed a genuinely inventive third option, an internal ramp spiraling upward through the body of the pyramid itself rather than piled up against the outside. Some microgravity and muon-based surveys have hinted at internal features that could be consistent with something like this. But consistent with is not the same as confirmed, and to date, no excavation or scan has definitively proven the internal ramp theory correct. That is, in plain terms, where things currently stand. We know the pyramid was built. We know, roughly, who built it and something about how they lived while they did it. What we do not know, what nobody has ever conclusively demonstrated, is the physical method by which the heaviest stones in human history were moved hundreds of kilometers and lifted dozens of meters into sky, over and over, with a failure rate low enough to leave no visible trace of disaster. If the transport and lifting questions represent a scale problem, the finishing work on the pyramid represents something almost more difficult to explain, a precision problem. The Great Pyramid you see today, gray, weathered, stepped like a staircase, is not the building that stood finished in 2560 BCE. Originally, it was wrapped in a smooth outer casing of polished white limestone, quarried at Tura, fitted so seamlessly that the entire structure would have gleamed in the sun like a beacon visible for enormous distances across the desert. Most of that casing was stripped away over the centuries, much of it repurposed to build the mosques and palaces of medieval Cairo. But a portion of it still survives at the base of the pyramid, and that surviving material is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. When the surveyor Flinders Petrie examined those remaining casing stones in the late 19th century, he measured the gaps between the joints, the seams where one enormous, multi-ton block met the next. The average gap, he recorded, was around half a millimeter. Half a millimeter across the touching faces of stones, each weighing more than a small car, fitted so closely that in places you couldn't slide a piece of paper between them. And the joints weren't simply pressed together, they were bonded with a thin, remarkably even layer of mortar spread across the entire contact surface, not just around the visible edges. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely difficult to picture. Cutting two enormous blocks of stone so precisely that their faces mate almost perfectly is a serious achievement done once. Doing it consistently, across the entire base of a structure covering 13 acres, using tools made of copper and stone, is something else entirely. A 1925 survey by the engineer J.H. Cole found that the total deviation in the length of the pyramid's base sides came out to less than 0.1%, a level of dimensional control that a jeweler working today would respect, applied at the scale of a structure built from millions of tons of rock. There's no room for a rough draft in work like that. A casing block cut even slightly wrong doesn't fit, and a multi-ton block that doesn't fit has to be dragged away, discarded, and replaced. To achieve what Petrie measured across the surviving stones, and by implication across the entire original casing, the builders had to be right, or very nearly right, an overwhelming majority of the time, across a project involving millions of individual pieces of stone. We don't have a full account of the technique that achieved this. We have the measurements that prove it happened and comparatively little explanation of exactly how. This is the part worth being precise about, because it's also the part that got badly distorted once clips of the exercise started spreading online. A language model doesn't experience awe. It doesn't gasp at a half-millimeter joint or feel a chill at the thought of a 70-ton beam suspended 40 meters in the air. What it does is compare. It takes the explanation on record, copper tools, wooden sledges, wetted sand, organized labor, ramps of some undetermined design, and it checks that explanation against the physical result the explanation is supposed to account for. And in doing that comparison across an enormous volume of engineering literature, geological survey data, and archaeological reporting, it kept returning to the same observation, stated without drama. The documented method does not fully, mechanically account for the documented outcome. Not because something impossible occurred, but because a complete, demonstrated, physically verified chain connecting the tools to the tolerances has never actually been published. Pieces of it exist. The whole chain does not. That is a genuinely useful finding, and it's a very different thing from what the internet did with it. Within days, edited clips were circulating with captions claiming that AI proved the pyramids weren't built by humans, stitched together with ominous music and confident narration implying that some kind of national security cover-up was preventing the full truth from coming out. None of that reflects what the underlying analysis actually said. The system never proposed non-human builders. It never claimed suppressed evidence. What it did was quietly measure the distance between how certain our textbooks sound and how much of that certainty is actually backed by demonstrated physical proof, and it found that distance to be larger than most popular accounts are comfortable admitting. That distinction matters enormously because it points toward two very different conclusions, and only one of them is actually supported by the evidence. Here's something worth remembering about the last 2 centuries of pyramid scholarship. It has a genuine track record of speaking with far more confidence than the evidence justified and later being proven wrong. For generations, the standard account, repeated in classrooms and popular history alike, was that the pyramids were built by armies of enslaved laborers, driven by force. It was stated as settled fact for well over a century. Then the discovery of the workers' village in the 1990s, the bakeries, the medical care, the organized burial grounds, dismantled that narrative almost overnight. The certainty had outrun the evidence.